So the character of Big Frank evolves naturally out of the book, and he eventually comes to be seen and heard later on in the book. And one of the things about him is that he's a very chilling character, as well as being by far the most intelligent, except for probably Manny Cole. And in one scene, he has an interaction with Tony D, who botches a situation for Frank. And one of the things that was interesting about this, and I wonder if you stole from Akira Kurosawa here, is Tony D goes into the meeting with Big Frank knowing that it's very likely that he could be killed. And eventually it comes to pass that is exactly what happens. Now, Big Frank talks to him, and like the bad sleep well, Tony is all more willing to be sacrificed for the good of the organization. There's also a great scene where, before he's led out to his death, a drop of rain hits his eye, and then a spider is kind of in the background, and it's not referred to as a spider. It's referred to, a web is in the background, and the creator is coming to go devour this insect. Now that obviously is a great symbol for Big Frank and Tony D, or Big Frank just and the rest of the organization. And I want you to talk about that scene, because that scene evolves out of a character that we don't even know that much about, yet he becomes at least on par with Gino as an interesting character, and very complex, for he's extremely smart as compared to the rest of the characters, but also at the same time he only knows how to get power, and he doesn't know how to use it. He's one of those corporate types that once he reaches the very top of the level, isn't able to expand outward from that.
Well, Tony Delaguardo is the character, and Tony represents the old guard. We see him in some scenes later in A Norwegian in the Family. Here, it's implied that he was the right-hand man of Paulie Maravelli. Heading into this book, it's assumed that what's his name, Dario Sandoval, who's also called the Spick, that he was the killer.
There are several Spicks.
Yeah, that he was the killer. But we find out, I think we find out in this book that he basically was just a fall guy that Big Frank had set up, or he took the blame. So and Big Frank rewarded him. We don't know the mechanics. That comes out in the later book. Tony Delaguardo is ignorant of this. He has no idea that Big Frank is behind it all. And so Tony is trying to find out what happened to his boss. This is in the mid-'70s, so this is about 7 or 8 years after the events that led to the death of Paulie Maravelli, which on like a day or two before Martin Luther King was killed. And so he hires Gino. He hires Joey Greco, who's Gino's sort of mentor when Gino finally got into the mob, to go find stuff out. He obviously doesn't have the best judgment. And he is someone who's loyal, and he thinks Big Frank is loyal to him, and Big Frank plays upon this. And Big Frank actually probably knows all about Tony D's looking into things, and sets things up so that Tony will feel guilt that eventually he capitulates into it. And that leads to probably the two major scenes of violence. I mean, there was a lot of doubling in this book. And that's even more pronounced in A Norwegian in the Family. For example, there are the two great supervillains, Big Frank and the Norwegian, in this book. And then there are the two great acts of violence. There's the Massapequa Massacre, where like 5 people are killed. And then there's the rape of Cindy McGee. So Tony Delaguardo is someone, though he's a man of principles, which is why he ends up submitting. Someone like Big Frank, when growing in the 1970s, and I think I touch upon this a little bit in this book, they were called New Wave gangsters, just like you had New Wave films. These were the guys who would openly deal in drugs. The mafia always did. They never didn't do this. That the fact that they didn't deal in narcotics is just a Hollywood creation. In reality, they always did. So I'm playing upon a bit of the movie stuff there as well. Tony Delaguardo is old school. He's someone who'll go down for his boss or whatnot, and he thinks that he's fucked things up because he thinks that he's somehow allowed Dario Sandoval to get away with the murder by screwing this up, because he sets in motion the Massapequa massacre, which ends up killing up a made man in another mafia family, which then he has to give up his life so that there isn't a war between the families. But Big Frank is interesting character too because he wasn't part of the original book. It was just going to be a generic mob boss who took over from um, Paulie Maravelli. There's no mention of Big Frank, for example, at Paulie's funeral, which is described in Tumbleweeds. Now, some people, there are other characters that we see in the funeral that I show in another aspect in a Norwegian in the family, and a lot of people would be like, "Well, how can you do that? How can you sort of revise this?" Well, we do that all the time in real life. So every iteration or every retelling of a story will have different things going on in it. When you have two characters that are talking about the same thing, you're gonna have different interpretations of it. So it's natural to do that. And Big Frank didn't evolve until maybe the fourth or fifth draft of the book. And then I did his chapter, and I said, "Oh, I got to give him his own chapter." And I think I already had the Norwegian in the book, so that gave me a second pillar to hang. These are the two guys that rise up above the muck that is the life of the Vincetti brothers. Someone like the Norwegian is, as I say, someone like a Mickey Mantle that people in Gino's position would look up to as someone. Oh, I could be like him. And Big Frank, because he's the boss of the family, he's also someone who's looked up to. Uh, Big Frank is the most clever of the characters. He's clearly pulling strings. Um, we get a sense of the milieu that he's in when he's talking about that black gangster who appeared on the New York Times uh, cover. And yeah, I mean, I try not to be too overt with symbolism, but every so often you can sneak in something poetic like that because you do want to sometimes give a little bit to some people who may be slow to understand what's going on. So you give out a little bit, but you don't want to overdo it and do it in every situation. So you
Well, it's not as if the symbol is even that trite, because if it was a spider going and killing the insect in the web, no, it's inverted, because it's only referred to as a creator, and you can imbue a lot more into that too. You can talk about it's kind of Moby Dickian symbolism as opposed to just the usual trite things you see in most novels.